Good evening to everybody. Welcome to session 5 of the Notre Dame Student Peace Conference. And our panel is centered on peace and the global economy. I am Isabel Guisa Gomez, a PhD student in political science and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame. And to serve as a moderator for this panel entitled Capitalism as an Economic Injustice. Before introducing our remarkable panelists, let me do some housekeeping and remind us of the rules for each panelist will present their paper for 15 minutes. After presentations by our two panelists, we will turn to the Q&A round. For our audience, please feel free to drop off any questions and comments you may have in the chat window in our Zoom webinar. I will collect questions and read them out. Then each panelist will address them. And then we will close by offering a few takeaways from our discussion. So let me introduce our remarkable panelists and speakers for today. First, we have Iman Sultana from the University of Waterloo. Her paper is entitled, How Fast Demand Are Complicit in Global Injustice, Xinjiang edition. And we also have Hans Geber from Regis University, and his paper, his co-authored paper indeed, is entitled Economic Class as a Determinant of Economic Life Among Rohingya Refugees in Cox's Bazar. Welcome all panelists, and thank you for joining us today. Iman, good evening. You are the first speaker and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Iman, as already been said, and I'm excited to present my research with you. So just bear with me while I share my screen and we'll be good to go. All right. Can everyone see? All right, perfect. Okay. So as mentioned before, my research is on global injustice in the Xinjiang region of Western China. I'm specifically focused on state-sponsored forced labor and how the fast fashion industry's role and complicity in the Uyghur genocide. So yeah, so just as a bit of an introduction there, I will be focusing on the ongoing conflict between the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and the Communist Party of China. And for the purpose of redirecting this conversation away from mainstream discourse and analyzing it from with a slightly different lens, something that's a little less ordinary. And while, again, the plight of the Uyghurs and their national struggle has been much more prevalent in recent years, there has not been as much focus on the links between forced labor, global supply chains, and the marketplace. So yeah, just a little bit of context for you. Disputes between the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese have persisted for centuries. Struggles for regional autonomy and control over the region are fraught with competing loyalties and perspectives. A lot of this is actually rooted in land, and it's linked to Uyghur identity, as well as the Chinese, China's importance on national and economic security. And that has been their reason for prioritizing that region. And so there have been a lot of clashes between different cultures, different identities, natural resources, religion, and so on. And while this history is very complex and nuanced, too much to get into today, a few notable events would include the independence of the Uyghurs in the 1700s, with the Manchu Qing dynasty invasion in 1759 AD, as well as the successful overthrow of that dynasty about a few years later. And while the Uyghurs have managed to successfully overthrow the dynasty and establish Kashgaria, which is also known as East Turkestan, they were once again invaded by that same dynasty no more than 20 years later, and the region became officially known as Xinjiang. And the Qing dynasty remained in power until the early 1900s, when the Chinese Nationalist Party overthrew their regime and wound up taking over the entire region. And it has been like that to this day. And while the Uyghurs have definitely fought against the Chinese government to reclaim that region and their autonomy in the process, they were unable to do so on account of the Soviet Union's interventionist efforts supporting the Chinese Nationalist Party. However, the Communist Party of China did manage to overthrow the KMT and have occupied the region ever since. And so Xinjiang's geographical position and wealth of resources make it very valuable to China. But unfortunately, the outcome of this, especially the recent economic developments, which had a boost in the 1980s to 1990s, but really since the 1950s, this has forced Uyghurs and other minority groups to suffer a lot of cultural and religious suppression, as well as familial separation, torture, displacement, among many other things. So just to analyze this on a bit of a deeper level, as a collective and a people, the Uyghurs have always desired sovereignty in their own land, at least what they see as their land, and the freedom to define their own identity on their terms and with their values. Whereas the Chinese government's interests lie primarily in obtaining political loyalty by pushing toward cultural assimilation and exploiting the land's resources for profit. And again, much of this is rooted in national and economic security. And the Uyghurs' need for independence and autonomy over the land, this remains an obstacle to the Chinese government's goals. And their goals primarily revolve around wanting to become increasingly independent from the Western world, so then they can define things on their terms and not on the West's. And this narrative is actually confirmed by Rahima Mahmood. She's a prominent Uyghur activist in the UK, one I've actually had the privilege of corresponding with. And she believes that the destruction of her people and identity is occurring specifically through the loss of language, culture, and history. And this is actually quite evident, as we've seen in recent news that the Chinese government has established internment camps for the purposes of re-education and forced labor of men, women, and children. However, since the Chinese government is primarily interested in national and economic security, I cannot stress this enough, they do feel justified in targeting their minorities. They might not see it that way. Really, they see it as more of a quest to achieve ideological unity and break free from the control of foreign powers, specifically the United States, but also European powers as well. And this is quite evident in a statement made by the former leader of the Communist Party, when in 2012, when he said, "The Western world is threatening to divide us. The international culture of the West is strong while we are weak. Ideological and cultural fields are our main targets." And so as far as international response goes, a lot of prominent academics, activists, human rights practitioners, as well as civil society organizations are now waking up to what's going on in the region. Obviously, there are still things that we do not know, but what we do know is that this is, quote, the largest forced incarceration of an ethno-religious minority in really the last century, where upwards of 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and this is a conservative estimate, have been forced into internment camps for re-education, thought transformation, and the like. And so citizens in various countries across the Western world have publicly denounced the Chinese government's actions through boycotts, rallies, petitions. Much of this was going on before the pandemic, but it's still going on under the surface today. But what I would describe as a wicked problem is that in spite of all of this recent attention and backlash, there is still one industry that remains glaringly overlooked and continues to exploit the injustices of the Uyghurs for their own profit and enables the Chinese government to carry on with their forced labor detentions. And this would be big brand corporations that make up the fast fashion and textile industry. So according to several human rights groups, most of the world's big brands continue to use cotton that is sourced from this very system. And the statistics might actually shock you, but at least 85% of China's cotton is produced in Xinjiang. And this is actually 20% of the world's total cotton supply. So just to make this a little bit more, down to earth, aside from just citing data, approximately 1 in 5 cotton products sold across the world are tainted with forced labor from this region. And if you just want to take it to a personal level, this would pretty much be the clothing in your closet. 1 in 5 items would be coming from this region and tainted with this forced labor. And so this sort of begs the question, why do fast fashion brands continue to manufacture cotton sourced from Xinjiang in light of all of this recent attention and recognizing that they could be penalized, for breaking international law? And I think it really comes down to understanding fast fashion's priorities, which can be broken down in the following ways. Really, when it comes down to speed, they prioritize speed in the sourcing and manufacturing of their products, relevance, so they can market themselves in a highly competitive commercial fashion market, and consumer demand. They can maximize their net profit by meeting the demands of their consumers more readily. And, Simon Fisher has a great breakdown of this, but for the sake of time, I won't go into that. So I guess really the question comes down to, what are these incompatible goals, between the Uyghur Muslims and the fast fashion industry? And I think it's really rooted in the fact that the latter, the fashion industry, is only able to accomplish its goals at the expense of this collective, or so it thinks. And again, we can see that since 2017, the number of Uyghurs who are operating in these places, both inside Xinjiang and across the country, they are sourcing cotton and other products as well, for at least 82 global brands, at least, not just in clothing, but also in technology and automotive sectors. And so, Apple, Gap, Nike, Volkswagen, and so many more. And so it really comes down to figuring out how can we address this wicked and complex problem. And I think that while some of the previous diagram models that I showed and didn't get into too much, but while they do help break down what the causes are and the enabling mechanisms, they don't really address who is best equipped to address these root causes and push for transformation. And I would argue that one party that does have the ability and power to shift this dynamic would be consumers. Or more accurately, consumer demand, in playing a role in not only perpetuating this injustice, even if unknowingly, but actually correcting it and reversing it. So I think as consumers, we can ask ourselves a few questions. Really, what are we demanding? And how are our collective demands perpetuating injustice or putting a stop to it? And in addition to that, what has to change in our mindsets and habits in order to affect sustainable transformation and reimagine justice in this context? And what does that look like practically? From sourcing to manufacturing to marketing to the clothes that we have in our closets. Oh, there we go. So just a bit of a Spider-Man reference for you. But I would, again, as I said before, I would argue that consumers have the power to change fast fashion's priorities for speed and relevance by actually demanding something else. We can demand sustainable and ethical products that factor in good health, fair wages, transparency in supply chains, as well as environmental production. The fast fashion industry is one of the biggest environmental pollutants on the planet, much more than aviation and other industries that we might suspect. And also just recognizing that we have a unique opportunity to take meaningful action in this way. It's not something that's far removed from us. It's something that affects us right at home. And it just goes to show how connected this world is and how we need to be a part of be a part of making change in a meaningful way and demanding more of the institutions and corporations that provide our products. And so this is just a quick summary of everything that I've already said here. I would just say that really it comes down to us as consumers having the power to demand something else. And while yes, definitely laws and policies are very important, it is difficult to actually hold these institutions accountable at those levels because of the lack of transparency. And so this is a role that we can have as consumers in creating change. And so, yeah, just to summarize, there is definitely a need for a more holistic approach, not just top down, but also bottom up. And in the daily choices that we make, as well as educating ourselves on these issues and recognizing that the world is a lot smaller than we might think. And also looking at this as not something that we need to be overwhelmed by, but something that is a unique opportunity for us to solve issues and to affect change in a meaningful way. As Fisher has said, a problem that impacts and is inclusive of everyone. And so I guess the takeaway here and the call to action would be that, you know, for those of us, especially those of us here at this conference, we care about human rights, we care about the environment, we care about marginalized communities. This is something that we cannot overlook and we need to be paying attention to. And this is not just the job of government officials or nonprofits. This is something that we all need to be taking seriously. And I will just leave this quote here from Chief Rabbi Ephraim Ravis, something I find very inspiring about taking responsibility. And that's pretty much it. And for more information, I recommend these resources. There's also a PDF on the site, but if you have trouble accessing the information, feel free to message me. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ima. Such an impressive management of time. So now we would like to turn to our next speaker, whose paper is entitled Economic Class as a Determinant of Economic Life Among Rohingya Refugees and Cox's Bazar. Hans, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Can everyone view my screen? Great. I just want to start by extending a big thank you to my other panelists for their very insightful presentation and to the moderator and organizing committee for this fantastic weekend. Wonderful. So my presentation focuses on reframing integration by looking at the social reproduction and class among Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. This research is ongoing and it's being done with Dr. Mausami Mahapatro of the Department of Politics, History, Politics, and Political Economy at my home institution, Regis University. This presentation will be structured around a few key points, starting with the motivations and origins of this research project before giving some important context about the case study and also just summarizing what the literature review among refugee studies says about integration, its goals, and the theoretical or conceptual inputs for this framework before using the case study to critique the framework that traditional scholarship is used to assess integration or resettlement and conclude with some initial findings and, of course, they are developing as we go. Okay, so beginning with motivations and research questions. As a student of political economy, I'm naturally interested in international political economy, particularly the ways that political and economic structures lend themselves to civil conflict and crisis, which brought me to Dr. Mahapatro because refugee movements look very different depending on the context, not only where these refugees might be coming from, but also where they are resettling. And new economic systems are emerging with the rise in refugee settlements and camps that are sort of more insular than other contexts in the global north, and we'll talk about that later. So this prompted 3 different research questions at the start of this project. The first is, how has a focus on south to north refugee movement limited our political or conceptual understandings of integration? Second, how do class and social differentiation manifest themselves in selected refugee contexts? And how do these findings complicate the international policy approach to refugee integration? That is, to interrogate the ways that the United Nations, NGOs, and national governments have used policy to guide integration in different contexts. So some brief background before we talk about the research project. The Rohingya are among the most well-known stateless people in the world, and this began after the post-colonial government declared them as illegal aliens. The ethno-nationalist state began a violent campaign to expel Rohingya from the Rakhine state, which can be pictured on that map there. This campaign included a process of selective identification, much in the same way that Jews were forced to wear stars before the Holocaust, or the Tutsi people in Rwanda. They were given separate identifications so that the state could easily pick through large numbers of people and decide which need to be the subject of force and They also included like economic deprivation. So the state intentionally stopped the flow of capital and resources within the Rakhine state in order to sort of squeeze Rohingya out of that region. And it also included direct violence at the hands of the military. And it's important to recognize that this campaign has transcended regime types. Myanmar or Burma has moved back and forth between dictatorship and democracy, but their status as persecuted people has not changed. The Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the president of Myanmar during their democratic era, which ended in 2021, downplayed the severity of the crisis and denied the military's persecution, famously saying that 50% of all Muslim villages are still intact, which of course concedes that 50% are not, and that's a failing grade. It's important to recognize that today more than 1 million refugees have fled Myanmar, with nearly 900,000 arriving at refugee camps in Cox's Bazar. Given how close the Rakhine state to Cox's Bazar is, that's not a huge surprise. And it's also important to recognize that Bangladesh is already one of the most densely populated countries in the world. And if you exclude the Vatican, it is the most densely populated country in the world. And this is part of the reason these camps are being established. Countries in the global south don't always have the same political or economic capacity that states in the global north do to approach integration via assimilation. And so this is markedly different from the global north, wherein refugees are enabled to move more freely. And that's important to understand because it means that new spaces are being provided for entirely new political and economic structures and systems to develop. And it also changes the very nature of integration from a northern perspective to a global one. The review of the literature discovered like a few different things that can help us understand where class might inform the different economic lives of refugees within the refugee populations themselves. The first is health studies. Different health journals have hinted at some degree of differentiation among refugees by observing disparities in access to healthcare and healthcare outcomes, though it hasn't really focused on the refugee camps, which is the focus of our research. And similarly, gender studies have overwhelmingly shown that refugee women are likely to experience discrimination and violence, which inhibits the kinds of economic prosperity that other refugee men are able to experience. And what this shows is that differentiation among refugee contexts is possible, but the refugee canon of literature hasn't really focused on class in the same way that it has on health or gender. And this has had an incredibly homogenizing effect, though this is some kind of exceptions exist. For example, some research has been done to show that Syrian refugees in Turkey and various West African refugee movements do show that class can affect integration or economic life. And I want to pause for a moment to talk about that Omata article because it analyzed the ways that mobility and class interact. Mobility has been a long-standing principle of refugee integration. It was one of the first agreements, it was in one of the first agreements signed by the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And it's important to recognize that this research really complicated the way that we think about mobility because it showed that the amount of money you had before you were displaced directly correlates to how like your ability to access mobility and then your ability to access the benefits that mobility can bring. For example, new lines of trade and travel, all of which can improve your economic situation. And so this prioritization of mobility hasn't really been accessible to all refugees. Instead, it's only reproduced the inequalities because of the benefits that are only accessible to a select few. And this is important because it shows that the context under which refugee studies began, which was after World War II, where the largest refugee movements would have been happening in the global north after the Holocaust, don't always apply to the global south, where things look differently in terms of class and refugee movement. Wonderful. And so we sort of found a conceptual framework for integration that summarizes a lot of different key points. So for example, philosophers and critical theorists and economists and policymakers all think of integration differently. And we found one kind of conceptual framework that summarizes all of these. So we have 4 different domains of integration. First is means and markers, which includes the material aspects of life. So things like employment, housing, education, and health, which can all indicate how successful integration is going if you can get a read on how to what extent refugees are experiencing employment, housing, education, and health. And then there's social connection, which focuses on the different social bridges, which include connections between refugee groups and the host population, social bonds, which focus on different social connections within the refugee group itself, and social links, which focus on the ways that the refugee is able to build social connection with the state or representatives of the state. The third domain of integration is facilitators, which is language and cultural knowledge and safety and stability, which are sort of like the stimuli that allow all of these other things to happen. So for example, if you can speak the language well that you're going to be surrounded by, it's more likely that you're able to get quality employment with high wages. And so you can sort of see how the facilitators of integration connect back to the material aspects. And the very foundation of integration is rights and citizenship. So to what extent does the state recognize political or citizenship rights through legal domains? And this is a lot of information, so don't think that you have to absorb it all right now, but we're going to talk about the case study and explain how the case study complicates or underpins each of the 4 domains and use that analysis to critique the conceptual framework itself. But before we do that, just summarizing what our methods were. So this research is based on 2021 fieldwork done by Dr. Mahapatra in Cox's Bazar, Kutupalong in Bangladesh, and earlier fieldwork was also conducted in 2017 and 2019. And as part of the fieldwork, interviews were conducted with Rohingya household and other key informants, including NGO staff, Border Patrol, police officers, Rohingya block leaders, and ward members. This provides insights because it reveals differentiation that is otherwise hidden. You actually have to walk into the homes of Rohingya households and talk to them in order to understand what economic life looks like, rather than just looking at the statistics or even getting it from the one-sided perspective of an international organization, which of course has an incentive to say things might be better off or more stable than they really are. So let's apply and critique the framework based on our observations. Starting with the material aspects or the means and markers, let's begin with employment and labor. The first thing we noticed was that there was a strong gender differentiation in terms of employment. For example, women could be observed sewing masks for the pandemic in large factories, to the credit of the previous speaker, who actually talked about the ways that the global South is exploited for fashion and textiles. And also men, on the other hand, could be observed doing things like paving roads and doing construction in the camp. And so there's a clear distinction in who was allowed to do what labor based on gender. And there's a similar dynamic playing out for class as well. So economic opportunity within the camp is rather limited. And so a lot of people, in order to find higher wage jobs, have to seek employment outside of the camp. And to do that, you have to find the means to travel, which can be really expensive. And also, for example, if you want to start your own business or go on a fishing expedition, you have to take out the loans in order to rent the capital or equipment that is required to do that. And that requires a barrier of entry almost. For people that have more money, they're able to access or overcome that barrier. And for people that don't have the same kind of money left over from displacement, are not able to access quality employment. What this shows is that not only does class affect or guide experiences with integration, but it also reproduces itself because of the benefits that are inaccessible to some. Healthcare, very similar. On-site healthcare was of really low quality, and sometimes even for serious injuries, NGOs would give out aspirin, and so it forced refugees to seek care outside of the camp limits, which again is extremely costly and only accessible to those who have some kind of wealth or property that's left over from displacement. And housing, again, the appearance of housing was relatively homogenous in terms of appearance, but the more you actually put yourself in that environment, it was clear that there were more subtle indicators of class. For example, the appliances that you owned, the furniture that you had inside your dwelling definitely showed different levels of class and the way that comfort is experienced within the home. This is really important social connection because it allows people to feel safe or like they are actually wanted in the host country, at least according to the traditional scholarship, but it's complicated by the observations we had during our survey, but Dr. Mahapatra had during her surveys. So let's start with social links, which if you remember, maybe not, is the connection between refugees and the state. It was clear that political leaders among the Rohingya are disproportionately men who owned wealth and property when they lived in Myanmar, which indicates that either your positioning within the Rohingya community itself or just the actual capital that you have makes it easier to negotiate and interact and encounter political structures as they exist within the camp, and also how they connect to Bangladesh or Cox's Bazar as a principality or state itself. And also language skills. For example, if you were able to make connections with the NGO or the state or other structures that exist that are supposed to facilitate strong integration through things like an ability to speak English, you were able to secure assistance and aid in a way that those who are not able to speak the language are not. And to gain those language skills, you have to have an education that is accessible to, again, a very select few in Myanmar. And secondly, social bridges, which is the connection between the refugee groups and like the community partners, or I guess host populations, which is very limited overall because, again, in the global south, refugee contexts are very different because it's camps and they're zoned away from the host populations. And so it's much more insular than what we think of refugee movements in the global north. But we did notice some, and there was some exception to this rule. For example, Dalals, who are traffickers who smuggle Rohingya to and from other countries, were able to make connections with Rohingya. But the social connection to the host population is preceded by payment. Your ability to pay someone in order to like have a relationship with you that is mutually beneficial, supposedly, is an indicator that class affects one's ability to be part of the host population or to connect with those individuals. Facilitators. Let's first talk about safety and stability and extend the Dalal discussion. Because, for example, individuals who cannot pay are not able to pay to be moved around through different countries, it means that they're more likely to experience a lack of safety and stability. And similarly, women who are more likely to encounter various forms of violence are less likely to approach Dalals and ask to be moved around from country to country, which means that they're less likely to experience safety because of the risks they might incur by moving from country to country and crossing borders. And the second area of facilitators is language and cultural knowledge. And well-educated Rohingya were more likely to speak multiple languages, which again facilitates a more clear kind of integration where there's a degree of predictability because they're able to negotiate and talk to, like, for example, social workers on site or NGOs and secure a kind of assistance that's otherwise impossible. And finally, foundations. In terms of rights and citizenship, language skills and wealth were absolutely essential in the way that individuals could accumulate political power and thus negotiate with the states that exist. And this is something that's interacting with an emerging theory within refugee studies, which is market citizenship. The idea that rights are allocated based on your ability to contribute to an economy. And if you've ever heard in the global north, politicians talk about a merit-based immigration system, this is very, very similar because it shows that your acceptance into the host society is dependent on your ability to contribute, which necessarily makes it more difficult for individuals from lower class backgrounds to integrate. So our final conclusions, right? Initial conclusions. Three different takeaways. First is that existing frameworks are unequipped to assess refugee movements in the global south, which means that they're not going to be equitable, which is, of course, a principle we're all here to explore. And also classes not only affects the economic lives of refugees, but differentiation reproduces itself so that this kind of class interacting with refugee integration is cyclical and it reproduces itself within the camps. And finally, organizations that are responsible for facilitating refugee resettlement or integration, we don't really have a word for temporary resettlement, there you go, must reorient their approach to be cognizant of disparities within refugee camps if these approaches are to be sustainable and equitable. Before I conclude, I just want to give some brief acknowledgements. First, to the Center for the Study of War Experience at Regis for funding Dr. Mahapatra's fieldwork, and the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee for facilitating this fieldwork. And of course, to Dr. Mahapatra for her support and guidance on this project. Her willingness to include me in the research process continues to inspire me to pursue a career in international political economy. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Iman and Hans, for sharing these glimpses of your work with us. This is fantastic work. So we have a question from the audience for Iman. Could you please elaborate more on how the fast fashion industry contributes to climate change, a really important topic these days, as opposed to an industry like aviation or other industries? So if you could please provide us with more information on these interactions.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. So I think as far as I am admittedly a little bit biased because I'm very interested in ethical and sustainable fashion. So I imagine someone who's very interested in something like aviation might say differently. As far as measuring which one is a higher pollutant, it's difficult unless you have a specific measurement that is transparent for everyone. I have found information and sources, which I'm happy to link in the chat if you'd like, that actually have a ranking of the highest pollutants, and aviation is definitely up there. But I was actually surprised to see that fast fashion was, I think, in the top 5, and aviation didn't even reach that top 5 amount. And that was very interesting for me to read about. And I think there are a couple of reasons why. And I would say probably the biggest one is because China happens to be the biggest, biggest economy as far as, creating clothing and sourcing it goes. And as we know, China's environmental policies have not been, they've not been the best. Let me put it that way. Not to say that, other countries don't have work to do, but I think it's a combination of the size of their economy as well as the wealth of the resources in the region, especially in Xinjiang, that contribute to fast fashion's, ranking on that list. And yeah, is that, I don't know if that was any other part of that question, but I would say from my perspective, that's the highest one. And then as far as, as far as the environmental impact, I think it's very interesting to see how interconnected all of these issues are. The more that I do research and the more that I study, the more I realize how much the environment is connected to peace building and connected to human rights issues. Just from my perspective as someone who's been studying this, I think that most conflicts can boil down to land and scarce resources. And not to say that there aren't other factors, but I think that those are definitely bigger factors, especially in the global South, where there's an intimate connection and relationship to the land, something that we are a bit more divorced from in the global North. So yeah, okay, great. I'm glad I answered your question.
Thank you so much, Iman. I've also come prepared with other questions to keep our conversation alive. So I'm going to turn to your findings stress different levels of inequality that refugees experience in the global South, such as gender and class. And you gave us some data and some concrete examples how women and men face different forms of exclusion in the job market, let's say, in these areas where they are migrating after displacement. How do you theoretically conceive of the interplay of these different layers of exclusion? You gave us a framework that takes into account class and places it at the center of analysis, which is a great contribution to peace studies as a field. And I am more interested in understanding how you are integrating class or analytical tool to other layers of exclusion, let's say gender, ethnicity, or race. If you could please elaborate more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The observations from the surveys definitely indicate that different kinds of disparities are intersectional. The first disparity, of course, is the fact that Rohingya, to begin with, are refugees who have been the subject of discrimination and violence from states across the South Asia for decades. And the fact that we've now observed that individuals kind of retain class status even after displacement is in itself intersectional. But you're right in that also the kind of sexism and misogyny that happens in these refugee campsites is adds an additional layer of intersectionality, where the fact that women are making less and doing work that is paid less increases their dependency on men within the refugee camp context, means that you're going to reinforce social norms and the social contexts that cause differentiation to begin with. And so women of traditional, or like historically lower class, are significantly more likely to encounter unique hardship than, for example, a Rohingya man who owned wealth and property before displacement. So intersectionality is definitely a part of the way that refugees experience different kinds of integration.
Thank you for your answer. So you showed us how violence, peace, global market structures are intertwined in different ways and really different complex ways. And I would like to hear more about these interactions at national level. Your research gives us some insights into how market structures and industries are producing violence from different sides. But I would also like to hear more how these domestic factors are related to other global market factors from perspective. Can you hear us, Iman?
Oh, was that question directed to me?
It was directed to you.
I'm
yes.
sorry. It was cutting out a little bit. I apologize. So you were just asking me about the connection between the domestic and the international?
Yeah, precisely. So how these factors, these economic and political factors that are producing violence for this particular community, in your case, how we can think of these different factors playing at different levels as well, at the global and domestic level.
Okay, so I'll start with the domestic and then I'll work my way, up the system. So on a global level, well, there's definitely some research that I was doing for it was for a slightly different project, but also still connected. A lot of this affects the relations between the Uyghur Muslims and the Han Chinese in the Xinjiang region. There's been a lot of migration of the Han Chinese into Xinjiang, and a lot of this is actually very fascinating to research because there's a lot of environmental degradation on account of the increased economic development in the region. And so this has exacerbated, already tense relations between these two groups. So I definitely think that there is a sense of urgency, if you will, and definitely a need to understand this from an environmental lens, as well as, again, a domestic lens, and realizing that it's not just about, it's not just merely about two different groups that don't like each other or don't get along. They are the connection to the land itself is actually influencing their relationship with one another. And Baranovich, one of the academics I cited in my research, has described this as ethnicizing and politicizing conflict, and he described it as ethno-environmental degradation, which was actually a very fascinating concept that I'm still teasing out. As far as the international scale goes, this is actually something quite interesting because Xinjiang is actually very important to the Chinese government, not just for its wealth and abundance of resources, but because of its Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm not sure, for those of you who may not be as familiar, the Chinese government has been instituting this plan. And again, this is for increased economic gain throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and just really, I think it's supposed to be across the world. This railroad, if you will, it's almost like a recreation of the Silk Road. And this is just partnerships with different countries, economic partnerships in order to increase stability, but also to increase economic gain. And this is something that the Western world is both fascinated and also scared of. And so I think, understanding that for China, it's not just merely about them wanting to take on more land or just them, it's very easy to have, one side be the innocent party and another side be, the big bad, if you will. But there's actually something very strategic for China on that level, and something that will affect international relations, if not now, definitely moving forward. And we do see that, various countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, various places across the global South and outward that have been partnering with China. And if you're interested in that, I actually have been running my own space on China's growing role in the Middle East. I'm not trying to self-advertise here, but if that's something you find interesting, feel free to let me know.
Thank you so much, Iman. So turning back to Hans, your research shows how refugee movements across the global South have different impacts depending on pre-migratory stances and departing points, right? So I am quite curious to understand if your research can show us more, how do such class-based socioeconomic inequalities impact relationships with residents in places experiencing inflows. Those populations who were before refugees came over, and how class also help us understand perhaps contention and any type of tensions along class-based inequalities between these two sectors.
Sure. So first, let me just start by doing a little bit of background that wasn't included in the presentation. Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country, and the Rohingya are, I believe, over 95% Muslim. So originally in Bangladesh, there was a strong political will to provide refuge or asylum to these refugees, though as time has gone on, it's become increasingly difficult to sustain 900,000 people in a camp for a country that's already really densely populated. And so this has resulted in a lot of political pressure to become or to accelerate the process of negotiating with Myanmar to relocate these refugees back to Myanmar. And this process has included more than just totally kosher ways of trying to create this political will. Both Myanmar and Bangladesh have been found guilty of using disinformation and misinformation campaigns on Facebook and other social media sites to create a political environment in their country that says, we no longer want the refugees in Bangladesh, or we don't want them in Myanmar either. And so it's created a kind of precarity that exists not only for the stateless people, but a hostility, a new kind of hostility, especially in Bangladesh, which originally had a really actually quite beautiful call to include these refugees in the state. But that's sort of reversed as the actual consequences of sustaining such a large population have increased. And so there is a lot of newfound hostility. And I would say that this case study might be an outlier if we're going to use that to assess the rest of the Global South, because there is a religious connection that exists between Bangladesh and the Rohingya. But I think that similar context could play out, though I haven't necessarily seen an example where religion has been a motivating factor in the decision to include refugees. But given that these, like the costs incurred of hosting such a large population can reverse such a strongly held religious sentiment, I believe that that is likely going to be true for other contexts where the religious sentiment to include Rohingya refugees didn't exist to begin with. And so to answer your question, yes, it is very, very common for there to be a lot of hostility between host populations and refugee groups.
Thank you so much for this answer, Hans. So turning back to Iman, and this is the last question for you. I was quite intrigued by this claim that you are making that consumers ought to be blamed for causing violence. Could you please elaborate more on that claim? And also thinking of how we are to blame, let's say, corporations and industries that are the major forces behind this type of violence as opposed to consumers. Of course, there is agency involved in consumers, but I am quite intrigued by the fact how we can draw a direct line between consumers and an endpoint, meaning violence caused by consumer decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I think the term blame can often have a bit of a negative connotation. That's something I typically try to avoid. So if it came off that way, that was definitely not the intention. I would say that I think it really comes down to awakening consumers to not only what is going on, but what they can do. So, and the reason that I framed it in this particular way is because, you know, this particular crisis has received a lot of global attention. And I follow some groups on social media, and, I do a lot of research on this, and a lot of people are very, again, rightfully so, outraged by what is going on in the region, and they're seeing what's happening, but there's still a bit of a disconnect. And not necessarily, not to say that they're to blame for the disconnect. It's just, we've become very accustomed to, I would say, maybe speaking for myself, I don't want to project, but I think we've become very accustomed to seeing these racks of clothing and these products on the shelves, and we don't really think, where did they come from? Or, oh, they're very cheap, but who else had to pay that price in order for them to be cheap and accessible to me? And so I think really what I'm trying to encourage, and this is a conversation, this is just the start of a much bigger conversation that needs to happen, that does need to affect, change on the policy level and the international level as well. But to really say, what can we actually do, and are we paying attention? And so I've been encouraged, by the conversations I've had with a number of people who have, learned about this and realized I actually had no idea where my clothes were coming from. I didn't even think about it. I'm going to go do some research now and see if I can make some changes. And I think if a larger number of people start waking up to that fact and thinking, wait, maybe these are some of the questions I should be asking, what could change? And, does it cross their minds? And if not, then, why is that? And what can we actually do? And so I think a lot of it is coming down to just starting a conversation and asking those questions. And then from there, realizing that, maybe there are certain things that are out of our control, but there also are things that we can actually do to push for change right where we are. And it doesn't necessarily require us flying to the other side of the world or necessarily joining government. I mean, we can do that if we want to, but there are things that are in our power right now. So I wouldn't frame it as, oh, we're to blame for what was going on. The reality is this dispute between these two groups has been going on for centuries, since long before fast fashion ever became a part of the modern world. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something that we can do from where we are right now to make change. And this doesn't just apply to this crisis. This applies to sweatshops in other parts of the world. I know Bangladesh is definitely has plenty of those, and India and various other places in Asia and across the global south. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah, if not, I'm happy to have a conversation further in the networking room.
No, it definitely does answer my question. Thank you so much. And my last question for Hans. So reparation policies are based on a normative assumption that wartime wrongdoing should be redressed for all victims, regardless of their starting point and initial disparities. And actually, your findings are quite because challenge this normative assumption. They show different starting points and that refugees have different trajectories in terms of class-based inequalities. If you were to take a sort of a piece of advice makers, how should we think of reparation policies given such class-based disparities across refugees and given the fact that they departed from different points in terms of class before being displaced?
This is an excellent question. And I think it's difficult because at the same time, the international community is in somewhat responsible or complicit in the Rohingya's suffering. They tried very, very hard to establish democracy. And when that happened, nothing really changed for the Rohingya. And so I think first, the problem has to be solved where post-colonial states need to find a way to sort of find a way to build national identity without that coming at the expense of certain ethnic minorities, which is the reason there are so many genocides happening in the global south, is because the mixture of groups and the prioritization of some at the hands of colonial powers contributed to this. I would say that it's difficult to attribute blame to a particular party because, like the Uyghur example, these disputes have been going on since, before World War II and even hundreds of years prior to that. So I would say that any international response first has to take into account the fact that even in democracies, ethnocentrism or ethno-nationalism is used to build national identity, and that's the root cause. If, let's say, a state can be established that can be inclusive or multi-ethnic in its democracy, that has to come with some kind of institutional mechanisms, because I think you have to hold guilty parties accountable for the kinds of egregious human rights abuses they've attributed. But also when we have some kind of institution that is holding those people accountable, government by institutions becomes something that the people can imagine or foresee if they see it in action to begin with. And so I think it's really difficult to answer that question, because this kind of persecution has transcended regime type, and the international community in many ways has reinforced their persecution, though any solution does have to have some kind of institutional accountability for those responsible.
Great, thank you so much for your answer. So before closing our intellectually stimulating panel, I would like to highlight some major takeaways from your research and the discussion that followed based on these questions and coming contributions for the field that I see from your projects. First of all, I am how you are connecting peace, war, and political economy questions and issues. And this is really promising. And it reminds an introductory paper in the Journal of Peace Building, the latest issue that was released in December or January, if I'm not mistaken, that precisely stresses that there is a void in peace studies, that we have been concerned with reconciliation, trauma healing issues, which are, and we have learned a lot about those issues, but we have somehow neglected other structural issues and how the global economy and domestic markets have also a really important play in economic inequality, but also peace and war questions or violence questions. So your papers are going the right direction. They are going to broaden our understanding of the interplay of war or violence, peace, and other economic and political factors, both at the global and at the domestic level. Based on that, I would like to highlight 2 or 3 points that I found really interesting and that gave me some food for thought. And I think that would be really awesome to see how you are making progress on these papers and on these research projects. So Iman's paper claims that the sourcing, production, and consumption of clothing, textiles, and technology in fast fashion functions as a source of violence in your case studies. And I would like to see that statement more forcefully highlighted in your paper, in your future paper, or the outcome, the product that you are seeing from this project. Particularly, your paper argues that often overlooked factors such as forced labor, global supply chains, and industries engender violence for marginalized groups. And I think that is a key contribution for the field and how we can connect political economic questions to peace studies questions. Moreover, it claims that consumers are also, to some extent, accomplices in causing such injustices. And I think that another main contribution and strength in your presentation is how you are making connections between 2 different scales of analysis, global market forces and domestic factors, and how they are connected. And even I, in the United States, in Southern Indiana, can be also an accomplice in causing and making decisions and choices in the market. So I'd like to highlight these 3 main takeaways and contributions that I see from your paper. For Hans's co-author piece, I think that there are many contributions. One is how this piece challenges an implicit assumption that forced displacement causes an equalizing effect on pre-migratory inequalities. And this is really important, not only because your data show us that it doesn't stand up for this case, but also for this normative implication that I was trying to highlight in the last question that I raised for you. Cost or wrongdoing cost during large scale violence should be redressed for all victims, regardless of their starting point. And if you show us that that's not the case, that refugees and displaced persons are departing from different points, that is a really important contribution for our field and for the literature. Second, I would like to highlight how you are using class as an analytical tool and how you are retrieving it from literature in the 70s, 80s, when we were quite obsessed with class as an analytical and powerful tool. And your research on trends in socioeconomic inequalities among refugees after forced displacement. And it reminds us of how economic inequalities per se are really important to understand different outcomes and divergent trends and trajectories followed by displaced persons once they are displaced, and also host populations and displaced populations. And I think that these two are really big contributions. Third, I would like to see more how class interacts with other layers of inequality. Your data also show us, for instance, for gender, how women are doing really poorly in wages, despite of their abilities and also because of these different trajectories at previous forced displacement. So with these 3 remarks and takeaways, and I don't see more questions coming from the audience until now, I would like to close up our panel. And thank you so much again, Iman and Hans, for sharing your work with us. It was really fascinating to learn what you are doing, how you are helping us understand peace issues to other overlooked factors. And yeah, if we don't have more questions or more comments from your side, I think that we can close our panel. Have a good.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the kind comments in the in the chat as well.